Great. Are you doing any
I'll
introduction?
do a little introduction for you, Nigel.
Okay. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this first Thursday club from the QSI. For those of you who don't know me, I know most of you do, but for those who don't, I'm Suzanne Miller. I'm the business manager of QSI. So welcome to you all this morning. We have Nigel Barr with us from Stradia. Nigel is the Managing Director of Stradia, who specialise in, just to briefly summarise it, procurement, contractual advice and dispute resolution. I think Nigel maybe will elaborate on that later, but that's them in a nutshell. And he's going to speak to us about the new JCT2024 contract and what's changed, basically. So I shall hand you over to Nigel.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to this little webinar. So it's for an hour, so we'll kick off now and we'll finish at 9 o'clock. If you have any questions, then I'm happy for you to open your mic, or just put a question in the chat box. So let's make a start. So starting by way of an introduction to the contract, so the new JCT design and build contract, which is the one we're going to be looking at, the JCT are updating all their suite of contracts, but we're concentrating on the design and build contract this morning, which was published in May of this year, so brand new. I'm going to go through the amendments really to the JCT 16. So what are the differences? I'm going to focus really on the main differences. There are lots of small changes regarding some of the wording, but I'm going to concentrate on the principal differences between 16 and 24. But just before I do that, let me just let you know that with the JCT design and build contract, there are other sort of associated contracts. So we've got the subcontract conditions have also been updated and revised. So the design and build subcontract conditions together with the subcontract agreement. There is also an update on the subcontract, or the subcontract, should I say, and the short form of subcontract. So they've all been updated in line with the amendments made in the design and build contract. So there it is, the new contract. You'll notice it's not vastly different in appearance from the 16. In fact, it's more or less identical, apart from just some changes in the design, very slight changes. So when is this contract applicable? Well, pretty much the same as it was in the 16 edition. So it's going to be where the client wishes to pass design responsibility to the contractor, who will then design and build the works. This is where the employer will produce its requirements, setting out exactly what is required for the building, and the contractor will respond with contractor's proposals. No different there than the 16 edition. They haven't changed the sort of precedence in terms of the employer's requirements. Obviously, when there's a difference between the contractor's proposals in 16 and the employer's requirements, the contractor's proposals take precedence, and that is still the same in the 16 contract. So there's still obviously the opportunity for the employer to appoint an agent, an employer's agent, again with the 16, so no differences there. So just quickly, who's who in the design and build contract? Exactly the same as the 16, but just a refresher. So the employer then will engage the contractor using the design and build contract. The employer may decide to engage an employer's agent to act on behalf of the employer. It would be wise for the employer to engage a designer just to ensure that any designs that are prepared by the contractor do in fact do what they're supposed to do, and of course the contractor will engage design team as well, because they are responsible for the design. The contractor then will engage subcontractors, and it's obviously where the contractor is passing on design responsibility. It would be wise for the contractor to use the design and build subcontract, and of course then the subcontractor can also subcontract. So what's new then in this contract? What is different? Well, there isn't a huge amount of differences. It's described more as evolution than revolution. So there are some significant changes, but it's not hugely different from the 16. So this is kind of what we're going to be covering today. This is kind of the subjects that I'm going to be speaking about. So as you can see, we've got collaboration, dispute avoidance, and sustainability. So there's some big changes there. Communication and the contract has been modernised in some respects, and we'll talk about where the modernisation has come. Design and other liability. So the clauses regarding fit for purpose and reasonable skill and care have been changed. So we'll talk about that, which is a significant difference for contractors. Insurances, some small changes there, which I'll cover. Some additional relevant events and relevant matters have been added. So again, we'll cover those points. There's been some small changes with regard to fluctuations and another small change with regard to how the contract may be formed. So I'm going to cover those topics one by one. So let's start with collaboration, dispute avoidance and sustainability. So the way that it was dealt with, those subjects were dealt with in JCT16. They were optional choices that could be made. So you might recall in 16 in Schedule 2, Part 2, there were options to be had there. So with regard to things like acceleration, quotation, collaboration, collaborative working and so on. Well, some of those have now been taken out of Part 2 and embodied into the articles and the conditions. So, for example, collaborative working now is part of the conditions. It's part of Article 3. They've taken out sustainable development and environmental considerations. That's now built into the body of the conditions. And notification and negotiation of disputes, again, which was an option, is now embodied into Section 9 of the contract. So, so these are now not optional. They are written into the contract. So you could say that the parties who enter into the contract now must comply with these terms and conditions, unless, of course, the lawyers amend the contract. But they now become terms of the contract. So let's see how that's going to work in practice. So with collaborative working, that's now, as I say, embodied in Article 3. So that's actually part now of the contract. It constitutes the contract itself. So it's a really important amendment to the contract. You might be aware that, for example, in the NEC contracts, there are similar provisions for collaborative working, but it's now embodied into the articles of the contract. So a significant change. I suppose just giving you the wording of the clause, the parties now will work with each other and other project team members in cooperation and collaborative manner, in good faith and in the spirit of trust and respect, and address non-collaborative behaviour. So what does this mean then? I mean, is this going to be something which changes the contract significantly? Does it mean that we have to work in a different way? Is it, in fact, does it have any legal implications? I put the question there, is it more cultural or is it more contractual? So these questions have been asked, particularly with NEC in the courts. These kind of points have been raised with similar wording. And what the courts have said about these clauses is that they do create a contract of good faith. So we are contracting now to work in this way. But how enforceable is that? How different does it make the contract? So what do we actually do differently? Do we do anything differently than we did on other forms of contract? Well, some of you who are old enough to remember Sir Michael Latham and Sir John Egan and the sort of height of the partnering era, this was really fundamental to the reports that were produced and the way that we performed contracts during that period. So all this is doing really is reinforcing what some of you probably already do anyway in the way that you do business. but how do we do that in practice? What difference does it make? And in fact, if you don't act in this way, what could, say, the employer's agent do about that? Or should the employer's agent do anything about it? Does the employer's agent just take it that, well, if that's the way that we're performing, that's the way we're behaving, then so be it? But I think it's really incumbent upon the employer and the contractor to work together. And these are just some ideas I put together to sort of perhaps explain what might be different in this environment than perhaps it would have been in the 16 edition. So, for example, ensuring that senior management team are involved throughout the project and not just kind of intermittently getting involved. Ensuring that we perhaps have some project goals and expectations. Maybe set some objectives through a kick-off workshop, a startup workshop at the beginning of the project to understand what's really important about the project. How are we going to work together? How are we going to communicate? And so on. And for me, thinking back to some of the projects I've been involved with, a successful project usually revolves around effective communication, clear roles and responsibilities, clear process and procedure, and perhaps co-location of the relevant parties, and so on. So perhaps we do need to have a rethink if we're going to follow these terms as they're intended. So a few more things there, that maybe some additional training could be required. I'm sure most of you would feel that you can work collaboratively, or your teams work collaboratively anyway, but maybe there does need to be a refresher on collaborative working to fully embrace this clause in the contract. So what else has changed? Well, dispute resolution. It used to be, as I said, in the sort of optional clauses. It's now become mandatory that if a dispute arises, then the parties will notify each other of a potential dispute. So that's now an express requirement in the contract. You'll note that there is no early warning in the contract. They haven't gone so far as to sort of put an early warning or early advance warning provisions in the contract, but it now says that if there is a dispute, that should be notified to the senior executives. The senior executives are named in the contract particulars. Each party names one person to represent each party, and hopefully those senior executives will be able to discuss and resolve the issue. I would suggest that care is taken in selecting the senior executive, because you really don't want someone who's too close to the project, who's actually involved in the project, I don't think, nor would you want somebody who has no authority to reach agreement. Ideally, I think you want someone who's coming from outside of the project, who can come without being involved in the dispute already, someone coming with clean hands, perhaps to give their thoughts and ideas on how the problem could be resolved. So the senior executives then will negotiate the problem, the dispute, in good faith. Incidentally, it's not a prerequisite to go to adjudication. The right of adjudication still remains the same, of course, as it would under the Construction Act. But obviously, it would make good sense if the senior executives could resolve the dispute without costly dispute resolution outside of the contract. I would say, as I say, make sure you've selected your senior executive wisely. It may be as well, linking into the JCT requirement for a communication protocol. It might be that in the protocol, before we give notice of a dispute, we have something around a kind of an early warning type approach. So rather than launch straight into notifying senior executives of a dispute, we have maybe a sort of a process that that kicks in before then, that's up to you. That's up to the parties to perhaps include something in the communication protocol. A lot of my clients would operate a sort of early warning process, whether or not the contract has it in, which I think is good practice. So say the sustainability and environmental provision has been now absorbed into the conditions of contract in line with the government construction playbook. So we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but there's now an express requirement for the contractor to consider the impact of the works, and the contract's now encouraging the contractor to come forward with suggestions and ideas that might improve environmental performance and sustainability. So this is something which the contractor needs to take on board, consider the environment, consider any impact on the environment, and look to see whether the design can be enhanced, and come forward with possible changes to the designs to incorporate improvements in sustainability and environmental issues. These changes then could become a change under the contract. So in other words, the contractor could get paid for that. So it's really worth considering from a commercial point of view as well as anything else. This clause does not in any way change the contractor's design responsibility. It's just enhancing the design in terms of sustainability and environmental improvements. So that's now built into the contract. That's become a term of the contract. So the contract doesn't, by the way, introduce any environmental or climate change KPIs, key performance indicators. That hasn't been, the contract doesn't go that far, but nevertheless, as part of the employer's requirements, that could be built in there. That could be a term of the contract in order that we can gauge how successful we've been in environmental improvements. So how would this be managed in practice? Well, there are a number of suggestions. Here's just a few of my own. Perhaps ensuring that, again, that the senior management team are involved in the project, and not just leaving it up to the operational people to come up with these ideas. Maybe create a sustainability and environmental task team, some team made up of employer, contractor, personnel, design team members, perhaps, who are going to meet perhaps quarterly, half-yearly, to discuss opportunities for sustainability and environmental improvements. That could also then be linked back into the startup workshop that I mentioned earlier. So having a sort of kick-off workshop to introduce all of these things so people are familiar with it and understand what it's going to mean for the project. Turning to communication and modernisation within the contract, just one sort of general comment, actually, that throughout the contract now it's become gender neutral, which I think is a good thing, in line with other contracts. Communication, well, this is an interesting one, that we've now got provision in the contract for communications to be by email, which has now become an option. Now, of course, we already communicate with emails, but what the contract has done, it's giving us a choice now whether we communicate all our notices by way of email, or whether we take a more traditional route and communicate notices by more traditional routes, such as by hand and so on. It's an optional clause, so we can decide which way we want to go, but it is a bit of a kind of an all or nothing approach. So there is no option to carve out parts of the notices to be an email, part of them to be by traditional means. But with the exception, however, of a termination payment, this cannot be sent by email, but the parties can decide how all other notices will be served, whether they're going to be served by email or not. So it's your choice. Now, if we're going to use the email provisions, of course, then in the contract particulars, we state the email addresses that must be used for giving notices. So that's now a key part of this new provision in the contract. I'd be interested to know what you think about this. I mean, mostly we communicate by email anyway, but it's now become clear that, for example, a notice for an extension of time, a notice for a relevant matter and so on, these can all be clearly given by email if we go down this particular route. So turning to extensions of time and connecting that into notices, no change there really. The contract still is still not a condition precedent for the contractor to give notice if the contractor feels entitled to an extension of time. So we're still at where we were with JCT16. So there's no kind of time bar issue particularly, and I'm sure you all appreciate the case law around this, which I won't go into now, but effectively there is no time bar issue built into the new contract. This was discussed by the drafting committee, and it was decided not to make extensions of time a condition precedent. However, of course, if we've got any lawyers listening to this, it might be that you want to make an amendment to the contract to give the contractor a period of time by which notice should be given. That's a matter for you to decide, but as the contract is written, it is still not a condition precedent. Of course, it's wise, very wise for the contractor to notify as soon as a delay or relevant event has occurred or is going to occur. It would be wise for the contractor to notify at that point to ensure that the procedures are followed and the contractor secures its entitlement. Talking about design, some significant changes in the wording here when it comes to fitness for purpose. So you're probably aware of the general obligation under the Sale of Goods and Services Act 1982. So if there's no express term in the contract dealing with reasonable skill and care, then it's implied into the contract that it will be fit for purpose. So you'll probably be aware in the 16 edition, of course, there was a reasonable skill and care provision in the contract. However, they've changed the wording here just to make it clearer, really on behalf of contractors, with regard to their obligations for providing design, which is to the standard of reasonable skill and care. So in the 16 edition, it stated that effectively the reasonable skill and care was revolved around the same as an architect would have to an employer. So the 16 said the same liability as an architect or professional designer would have under a separate contract with the employer. That was felt not to be strong enough, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So now the wording has changed, and it's now emphasised that the design, the reasonable skill and care obligation is now exactly the same as an architect would have with the employer, not under a separate contract, but a direct contract with the employer. So design liability, the reason a lot of this has changed is because of things like the Building Safety Act coming into being in 2003, where there's a level of competence now required by designers to ensure that buildings do comply with the Act. So there's a bit more kind of, let's say, responsibility placed upon the contractor. And of course, when it comes to fit for purpose and reasonable skill and care, there's some significant obligations there. And some of you might be aware of this particular case, which goes back to 2017, where Hogard, the contractor, was engaged under a design and build contract to construct some offshore wind farm, or an offshore wind farm with something like 60 turbines. The contract overall was a reasonable skill and care. The contractor constructed the wind farm, and unfortunately, some years into the use of the wind farm, some of the holding down bolts and mechanisms on the undersea construction started to fail. And of course, that resulted in a claim from the client to the contractor, and it was found in the lower courts that that because there was a fit for purpose obligation with regard to the actual bolts themselves, there was a design life of something like 20 years for the design of the bolts, which was an express term in the contract. Although the contract overall was reasonable skill and care, because there was an express term embedded in the specification for the holding down mechanism, which was design life of 20 years, the court found that the fitness for purpose obligation, the design life obligation, sat above the overall reasonable skill and care obligation in the contract, which caused a bit of a stir. It went up to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal overturned that, and we ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court went back to the High Court decision. So this meant for contractors that it was a confused sort of picture with regard to when, for example, with embedded in a specification in the employer's requirements, it talks about a design life, then potentially that could result in a fit for purpose obligation, even though the contract contains an overriding reasonable skill and care provision. So what they've done then is they've gone on and added some words into the contract, into the JCT contract, that says now under no circumstances will the contractor be subject to any duty or obligation or fit for purpose. So so that's clear now. It should prevent any further disputes in this area arising. And I think that's good for contractors. You can maybe heave a sigh of relief now about that particular difficulty that I've kind of outlined. Now, of course, always with all of these things, that doesn't stop the lawyers amending the contract. So as someone who gets involved in reviewing and assessing contracts, just make sure that if the clause in the contract 2.17 hasn't been changed in any way, that it stays as it was originally written. If it has been changed, then take some advice. So it is a clause in the contract which is often amended. So has it all been resolved? Well, of course, the 24 edition hasn't really been used much so far. So we'll see whether that amendment has now cured that problem. So turning to quality, I'm sure you're aware of the Building Safety Act, which came in 22. I think I said 23 earlier, it's actually 22. It came into law, into being in October last year, so it became law last year. And of course, this principally affected high-risk buildings, but it will go on to affect all buildings in the end. But now in JCT16, we've got some provisions dealing with this Building Safety Act. It's been incorporated into the building regulations, into Part 2A of the building regulations. And what JCT have done is they've brought in the details of who is going to be the principal designer under the building regulations and the principal contractor. So there's now provision in Article 7 to fill in details of who within respective organisations is going to play that, take that role. This is different from the CDM regulations. So you still have principal designer and principal contractor in the CDM regulations. This is different. This is now in relation to the Building Safety Act. So yes, it does obviously affect high-risk buildings at the moment, but I'm sure that's going to affect all buildings in the not too distant future. So there's now an onus on the duty holders in the contract under the Act to make sure that their duties are performed in line with the Act. So placing a lot more responsibility on the duty holders to ensure that the Act is followed as it should be. Now, if either party fail to follow the Act, then that's grounds for termination by the innocent party, by the party who has followed the Act. Then that's grounds for termination now under the contract. So that's how important it is that we ensure that the Act is followed to the letter, obviously. So under Article 7, as I mentioned a minute ago, that's where we enter the details of who is going to be the principal designer and who is going to be the principal contractor under the building regulations, and in addition to the CDM regulations. So also, you might be aware that again, in the sort of in the JCT16, anything to do with problems in the ground conditions is always the contractor's responsibility. So there's been a change now, not entirely moving ground conditions as a responsibility for the employer, but certain things now have become the responsibility of the employer. So, for example, all fossils, antiquities, objects of interest that are found in the ground, that mean that the contract now allows the employer to give instructions as to what to do with those things. The contractor now must use their best endeavours not to disturb them, preserve them wherever possible, and potentially cease work in order to stop any impact on the preservation of these things, these items. Also, upon discovery of any antiquities, asbestos, contaminated material, unexploded ordnance, then the employer is going to give instructions on what to do with that. And of course, that will then lead to a relevant event and perhaps a relevant matter as well, which I'll come on to. I'll come on to that later as to how it's dealt with in the contract and what the contractor is entitled to do. But there's provisions there dealing with those situations if they arise. Insurances, there's been some fine tuning really on the insurance provisions where we're talking about professional indemnity insurance. It's obviously due to the market and so on. Insurance provisions have been changing, becoming perhaps more difficult to obtain. Some of the policies that perhaps we obtained 5 or 6 years ago, which the clauses now embody certain sub-limits and certain specific exclusions. Well, provided the parties are happy with that, those exclusions can now be included as part of the contract, simply because the market may only offer insurance policies with those exclusions in. So it's accepted that those exclusions can now be accepted as part of the contract. So relevant events and relevant matters. Well, of course, this is an important part of the contract for contractors, because this is where we're entitled to, or contractors are entitled to seek extensions of time and also loss and expense. Now, the principles remain the same. There's no difference really in the principles as to how these are applied. But what they have done in the contract is added in some additional relevant events and some optional relevant matters. So the relevant events that have been added, we'll come on to in a minute, but specifically, these have been brought about by some of the problems, a lot of the problems that were suffered during the COVID-19 pandemic, recognising that that perhaps may, hopefully not, but could happen again. So the contracts reflected that situation if it does arise again by introducing a specific relevant event and a relevant matter to cover that situation arising. So there's relevant event and a relevant matter for that. And incidentally, it uses the term epidemic, not pandemic. Now, I'm no expert in that field, but I'd be interested to understand what the difference might be there if there was a pandemic as opposed to an epidemic. Anyway, so we've got new optional clauses relating to relevant events. So remember, relevant matters, I beg your pardon, relevant matters. So relevant matters, of course, are the matters which entitle the contractor to loss and expense. And those are optional clauses, and we'll come on to them in a minute, dealing with changes in the law and discovery of things like asbestos, contaminated material, and exploded ordnance. So basically, they broadened the potential for relevant matters, although they have made these two, the last two I've just referred to, as optional. So when it comes to relevant events, turning back to relevant events, some additional ones have been added, just to repeat what I'm saying. So where the contractor discovers asbestos, contaminated material, or an exploded ordnance, that has now become, or those become, relevant events. The contractor can seek an extension of time for those occurrences, still giving notice, as they would ordinarily do for any relevant events in JCT16. The notice provisions haven't changed, as I mentioned earlier. So, so kind of moving a little bit more towards the employer taking responsibility for things discovered in the ground. So upon discovery, then the contractor must avoid disturbing these dangerous materials and so on. Of course, the contractor may then need to employ third parties to come and deal with it. There could be health and safety risks and so on. So the contract deals with that. So when we're talking about these particular matters, these events, then there are some preconditions. So the contractor has to meet these conditions. In order to get the extension of time, the contaminated materials, asbestos, cannot have been identified in the contract document. So if the contractor was already made aware of contaminated ground, contaminated materials, then in the employer's requirements, then of course that's not going to become a relevant event. The contractor already knew about it. I suppose there is an argument about the extent of the contaminated materials, but I suppose it depends on what's been included in the employer's requirements. And also the second prerequisite is that the material has not been brought onto site by the contractor. So it's not asbestos or any sort of contaminated fill that has been brought onto site by the contractor. So the extension of time will be granted for ordnance, irrespective of those conditions being met. So when we talk about ordnance, those two conditions don't apply. And just to make it absolutely clear, when we're talking about things like asbestos, it's only when excavating here, not asbestos that might be found in an existing building that we're refurbishing, just when we're excavating. So it has to have been covered over in effect. So the test would still be, obviously, an experienced contractor would not have expected that. And I guess that should also encompass the contractor doing a visual inspection of the site as well, to ensure that the contractor was, if the contractor was aware of any of this because it was visible, that might be taken into account. So also now the contractor would be entitled to an extension of time, as I said before, for an epidemic. And if the epidemic occurs after the base date, and the base date is stated in contract particulars. So obviously, if we're entering into a contract where we currently have an epidemic, then it's not going to apply. But if it becomes evident after the base date, then it can be a relevant event. Also, there's a relevant event now for a change in the law. So if following the base date, after the base date, there is a change in the law, the change in legislation, and that could include any guidance published by the government. So it doesn't necessarily mean a purely change in legislation. It can also be guidance that's published by the government or any other specified bodies which affects the execution of the works. So that's quite a step forward, I think. That kind of brings it in line with, say, X2 in the NEC engineering construction contract. So when it comes to a delay notice, you'll probably be aware that the contract requires notice to be given when it becomes reasonably apparent. That's still the same. And once the contractor has given that notice, then the employer now has 14 days to notify the contractor of any further information that the employer requires. So the employer can't just sit on it, having received that notification together with any other information the contractor has provided. If they want further information, if the employer requires further information, they must now do that within 14 days. So again, if I'm comparing this to other forms of contract, we're starting to see more timescale, more structure coming into the contract than we had before. And here's another change. You might recall in 16, the employer had 12 weeks to deal with an extension of time, to notify the contractor of an extension of time, having received all the information the employer had requested. So once the employer has received the information they requested, and remember, the employer has to do that within 14 days, otherwise they have to make a decision based on the information that the contractor provided initially. They've now got 8 weeks. I don't know about you, but I always felt 12 weeks was a ridiculous length of time, sort of, getting on for 3 months before the employer had to notify the contractor of an extension of time. Now they've reduced that to 8 weeks. Still a fairly lengthy period of time, but I think it's quite a step forward, because if you're a contractor and you are waiting for that reply, waiting to see whether you've got an extension of time, of course, in the interim, you have to work on the basis you're not going to get the extension of time, and you're working to the original completion date. So that, this is helpful. This is helping contractors a little bit now. And I think, to emphasize the point, really, employers need to be doing this as quickly as possible, not necessarily waiting till 8 weeks has more or less expired, but making that or giving that extension as soon as possible. That's got to be helpful to contractors. So these are maximum periods. They are maximum periods. Just as a point of interest for those of contractors on the call, in the corresponding subcontract, they've now made, they've reduced it from 16 weeks to 10 weeks for the contractor to notify the subcontractor of an extension of time. Once again, the contractor has received all the information that the contract requires. Changing subject slightly, but still connected to extensions of time. Where there's been a termination, where the contract has been terminated, there was a case recently back in 21, the Triple Point Technology case, where the court were asked to decide whether liquidated damages would apply right up to completion of the works following termination, or whether liquidated damages only applied up to the date of the termination notice, and thereafter that it was general damages. So the courts decided along those lines that that yes, the liquidated damages would apply up to the termination notification, termination certificate, and then after that it'd be general damages, and that's now embodied in this contract. So turning to relevant matters, we've just been discussing relevant events. Now you'll know that there isn't necessarily, if you're getting an extension of time, it doesn't necessarily follow you're going to get a relevant matter. So in other words, you can't necessarily recover loss and expense for every relevant event. So that position hasn't changed. So you've still got to notify your relevant event. And if you feel there's loss and expense, you still notify the relevant matter. The two are separate and remain so in JCT2024. But what they have done is we've got in an additional relevant matter, which deals with discovery of asbestos, contaminated material and exploded ordnance and so on, in line with the equivalent relevant event. So we've now got that as part of the contract. So again, as I said before, moving closer to other forms such as the NEC and also the FIDIC form in terms of entitlement for the contractor to recover loss and expense for certain types of ground conditions, contaminated material and so on. But it only applies in the ground. And the optional relevant matters, so this is a matter for the employer to decide whether these are to be used. So they're not mandatory, they're optional. So the first one is to do with epidemics. So if you feel as an employer that it would be sensible, reasonable and fair, if we do, hopefully not, but if we do encounter another pandemic, epidemic, whether you feel that the contractor should recover the costs as a result of that. And of course, this was quite costly during the pandemic for contractors in JCT contracts because, well, there was no provision to recover that. There was force majeure type clause, which dealt with the pandemic largely, but no relevant matter, no equivalent relevant matter. So contractors were getting time, but not money. So that can be now an option for the employer to include a relevant matter for a pandemic. Also, the employer might want to include a relevant matter for changes in the law. So this is again is an option. So if the law changes after the base date, we already know that that's an extension of time provision now. It's an entitlement to an extension of time, a relevant event, but we can have the equivalent as a relevant matter, which I think is reasonable. To have that as an option. So a change in the law could be something like, well, for the Building Safety Act, which came into being in October last year, or it could be changes in CDM regulations or changes in building regulations, anything of that sort, which has a cost implication. Then if we've made this an option, a relevant matter, the contractor can recover those costs, provided the change was after the base date stated in contract particulars. So contractors, when you're looking at this, go to contract particulars and see whether these two relevant matters are embodied into the contract. Fluctuations, well, not a lot to say about that really. What you'll notice now in the contract that the fluctuation provisions have been removed and they have been made an online clause. So if you want to embody fluctuations, there's still the option to do that, but you now go online. And what they've done is they've provided a lot of guidance with the fluctuation provisions. So it used to be a little bit confusing, I found, with JCT contracts as to how we dealt with fluctuations. Well, it's still an option to embody that into the contract using maybe indices or looking at costs of people cost increases and so on. We can still do all of that. And there's guidance notes now to support that, but we have to go online if we're going to use the fluctuation provisions. We've got to kind of look online to find out how we're going to embody that into the contract. So Schedule 7 has been deleted. You won't find anything in the contract now apart from the reference to the online website, the JCT website. So forming the contract then, just last comments, and then we've got some time for some questions and discussion. This is part of the modernisation of the contract. The contract, as you know, has an attestation page in there that would ordinarily be completed and signed by hand. That would form the contract. Well, in this modern age, of course, we have such things as DocuSign and so on. Now that's now permitted. So now the contract can be executed electronically using one of the available systems and electronic systems. So that can be now done. That's accepted. And as you're probably aware, we can execute the contract as a simple contract, giving us 12 years statute of limitations or 12 years if it's executed as a deed. Okay, so we've got time for some questions. We've got a few minutes. Feel free to open your mics and jump in. Let me just have a look at the chat box. Have we got any questions in there? So feel free to ask any questions that you might have.
Steve put in the chat a little explanation about the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic. And a pandemic is where it's global, whereas an epidemic is more local. So I guess JCT is saying if there's something that only affects us in the UK, but it's widespread, then it doesn't have to be a global incident.
Yes, it's a good point. Yeah.
So JCT are not saying if it just affects us in this country. If your supply chain has an epidemic, because of the way it's worded, that will also be claimable if it's in somebody else's country.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Are the relevant? Sorry, it's Keith Blizzard. Are the relevant events going to be follow the same changes going to be made in all the other contracts as well? Do you think?
Yes, I think so, because I'm sure it's going to be made in the standard building contract. We haven't yet seen that. And the intermediate contract has just come out. So yes, there will be in those contracts as well. Absolutely.
Will it make sense to standardise the contracts or standardise the changes across the contracts? Doesn't it?
I think so. Yes, of course. When you've got the minor works contract, well, we don't have the same sort of relevant events, relevant matters in that particular contract, for example. But yeah, the principles I think will be adopted in all the JCT contracts. It wouldn't be necessarily sensible to pick and choose which ones they apply to.
In my experience, when you've got disputes on minor works, quite often what people will do, I mean, because it's so broadly written, people still refer to the other relevant events and things in the other contracts, just as guidance, really.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes, it's not. It's much wider in the minor works. There's much more kind of flexibility there. It's left largely up to the contract administrator to decide whether it's something which will attract time and/or money. But yeah, they would use the relevant events and relevant matters in other contracts as guidance. Yeah.
And I agree with you. Actually, the 12 weeks was just ridiculous. To cut it down to 8 weeks to make a decision, that should be ample.
It should. I mean, as I said before, really, it's for the contract administrator, or in this case, the employer's agent, to act as swiftly as possible. It's in everyone's interest to get that extension of time, notified, so the contractor can get on and program the works accordingly. It's much better if it's dealt with quickly, of course.
But particularly when the courts have decided that the employer can issue a pay less notice and deduct liquidated damages as they see fit, before if the contract administrator or architect hasn't actually made a decision on the extension of time.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Then, of course, then there's the repayment of damages if damages are taken and the extension of time is granted. So it gets very messy. I agree with that. And that's why I'm stressing that for any employers, agents listening to this, is deal with the extensions as quickly as possible. And because now, remember, we're dealing with a collaborative form of contract, it would be sensible to meet with the contractor and go through the details collaboratively together, work on that extension of time together. Don't have the sort of table tennis kind of match where we're batting information backwards and forwards. Why don't we just have a regular meeting every fortnight and go through any extensions of time together collaboratively? That would be my suggestion.
And I think the changes to email, giving notices by email, people have been doing that for ages anyway.
Yeah, they have. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but I think it's now formalised as to where notices. I mean, some people do feel that notices should, for example, be served by recorded delivery. It gets a bit ridiculous, but I think it's now crystal clear that we have that option to use email.
Yeah, because recorded delivery, I mean, I've known it in my experience, where you send something recorded delivery and then the contractor or the recipient, it may be the employer, the recipient, the postman says, oh, this has got to be signed for, and they just say, no, we don't sign for any post.
Yeah.
And they refuse to accept it, so it gets returned.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah.
I'll shut up now. Thanks ever so much. Really good talk.
No, thanks, Keith. Thank you very much.
Just
any other questions from anybody else?
Hi, Nigel. Jim Button here. It feels.
Hi, Jim.
Hello, Nigel. Please, this isn't cynical. This is actually a positive comment. It feels like the JCT is addressing all the issues that were against contractors in a lot of these items. I'm a QS, private practice QS who's an employer's agent, and some of those things that they've addressed needed to be done years ago, where everything's the fault of the contractor unless they can find a way that it isn't. So it's quite positive. It does feel that that's been addressed.
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah, my only issue with it is I suspect there are construction laws all over the place crossing them all out.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, I think this is my view, having spent many years with different forms of contract, that this particular one, the design and build, to me, is one of the most heavily amended contracts ever. There's so many changes made in this particular contract because employers are looking for the cake and they want to eat it as well. And so, I agree with you that the lawyers will probably tinker around with these provisions.
It's all the things that a contractor had no control over that they're now saying, well, a contractor's got no control over, so accepted. But I think the answer to your point there, Nigel, is as a QS, as bill of quantities QS, construction lawyers don't actually understand traditional forms. They're much more knowledgeable on the design and build. I've had many contracts where they've said to me, what is it then? It's traditional with build. Oh, how does that work?
Yeah.
Can I just say, I appreciate that it has been twisted probably the opposite way to its original form, which when it was first started as the D&B contract, it was employer focused and transferring all risk to the contractor. It's gradually now flipped the other way around. The main reason why these contracts get so heavily edited is most projects are bank funded. And if you've got a bank, they're risk adverse. They do not want to have on the client side risk. So all it will do is mean that the lawyers will be sitting there amending these to get them back to where the concept originally started, as long as contractors accept contracting on that basis. And they will do, because contractors ultimately want money and are willing to put a premium on the price in order to take the risk.
I always use the analogy of a balloon. If you squash it down in one place, it just comes up somewhere else.
Clients are willing to take the price, but what they're not allowed to, what they can't do with banks is take cost uncertainty. And that's the problem with contracts like this, where once you start putting in a whole load of contracts on price uncertainty and time uncertainty, you just won't get funding.
And I'd be interested to see how people react to the collaborative clause that's been added into the contract, which is now part of the conditions, whether it changes behaviour, whether it doesn't. That's an interesting point. I mean, I'm an advisor on many different forms of contract, and I work for for Thomas Telford, the RICS, and people advising on contracts. And my view is that collaboration is key to the success of these sort of contracts, and I think it's so important that we don't ignore that clause and just say, well, so what? I think it needs to be taken into account when we enter into this new contract.
But in reality, Nigel, have you ever seen anybody actually really embrace it? They give it a cursory glance, really. And the problem with it is, until somebody actually puts some penalty to failing to comply with that clause, which they've never done on NEC, you're never going to get a situation where it's going to become inherent. People just will not do it.
I mean, I think it's incumbent upon, the employer's agent, the contractor, to make every effort to work in this way. And I think most people would want to. It's just the culture of our industry, the way that we set the contracts up, the way, behaviors that we learn from university, I think it just needs a cultural shift. And we've been saying this in our industry for years and years. But I think, simple things like having a startup workshop where we discuss process, procedure, communication, putting emails into the contract. Yes, that's a way of communicating. But what is the most effective form of communication? Well, face-to-face, isn't it? And of course, ultimately, when you've had your face-to-face discussion, then you confirm that through an email or in writing under the contract. But initially, discuss the relevant event, discuss the relevant matter. People, I think, need to be encouraged to spend more time talking.
Yeah, but I think that's true. It's relationships. That's the issue.
Yeah.
You can have a project that's gone wrong, but you're all getting on okay and understanding each other. And that helps. It's hard. I think it's hard to put that in writing. I think just picking up on another thing you said about dealing with extensions of time. A previous presenter said, I loved it. He said, make an extension of time application a pleasure to read. And I think people would be quite cynical about that, but we would all look at them in a better light if they were presented like that. And as you said earlier, when you get one of those, go and have a chat about it. Don't just hide away for 8 weeks and then say, give me something else.
Yeah.
But it is related. The problem is that we all work to contracts in all of our lives. It's how we relate with people generally.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the problems is, sitting as a tribunal, as an arbitrator and adjudicator, you see when people send emails, they write emails in a very different way to the way in which they speak when you see somebody face to face. I mean, this is one of the problems with social media generally. It's not anonymous, but the thing is, what they can do is they can be very aggressive in emails, and when you actually get them face to face, then I've had meetings where I've read emails, and the vitriol between the two guys, one from each party, they've been really downright rude and offensive in their emails. When you actually get them face to face, it's, hello, Pete, how are you? I'm great, thanks, how are you? And they're completely different people. And also, I think what people try and do, and I think they're a bit wiser about this, what they try and do is in their emails and their written communications, they try and paint a picture. I asked you last week, and yet I've still not had an answer. Go back through the emails. They hadn't asked the first time. But it just paints a picture. It's reading emails. I mean, and nowadays, of course, with emails, as I say, when I'm sitting as a tribunal, you end up with sort of 17-page emails. And quite often it's the ones that your attention is not drawn to, but they've given it to you, so you read the whole lot, and that's when you get a much better picture of what's been going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think obviously JCT are looking across to other contracts like FIDIC and NEC, and I think they've taken a few ideas from there as well, things that seem to work well. But okay, I recognise that we've gone past 9 o'clock, and I'm happy to stay on the line as long as anybody wants to. But I'm sure people would be maybe wanting to get back to the office or whatever. But what I will say as part of the closeout, if you do have any questions on this, or you want any further information, then there's my email address and my phone number as well. So please get in contact if you want. There will be a copy of these slides made available through Suzanne. Do you send them out as a matter of course, Suzanne, or do you?
No, we don't. But if you either pop a message in the chat now, and I see many of you are already doing that, or you can drop me an email at any time and I can send those out for you. And also CPD certificates, if you want one of those, again, the chat or an email. Absolutely fine. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for listening this morning. Been a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully, we'll meet again soon.
Thank you very much, Nigel. That was really, really interesting.
Really interesting talk as always, Nigel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
What I forgot to mention earlier was that Nigel is actually one of our new QSI ambassadors that we've appointed. So thank you, Nigel, for accepting that role. And it's great to continue working with you, of course.
All right. Well, thanks very much, everybody, and a pleasure to be an ambassador as well to the QSI.
It's good. So details of the September event will be coming out on the email early next week. So hopefully see lots of you again then. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.